In the fall of 2009, however, my school district, Laramie County 1, which is the largest school district in the state, and remember there are 5 school districts that educate over 50% of the students in our state, began transitioning to the Common Core. I spoke to both the curriculum director in my district and also the superintendent, and both of them told me the same thing, and that is that Superintendent McBride let them know that this was the direction the state was going, and so they went ahead and started implementing the Common Core. The state board had not voted. There had been no public comment period. Not a single parent had been notified. But Laramie County 1, the largest school district in the state, began implementing the Common Core in the fall of 2009. In January, that next spring, the Department of Education had a teleconference meeting with the State Board of Education, and in it, Superintendent McBride briefs the State Board of Education and says, hey, we applied for Race to the Top monies, $162 million. It's a lot of money. $81 million directly going to the districts in a proportionate scheme. McBride felt really good that we would have a chance of getting this grant. So Wyoming was in a race to get the Common Core adopted. And in the Race to the Top application, it was weighted. 70 points out of 500 were part of adopting the Common Core. So in April 16th at the State Board of Education meeting, the clock is ticking and you can clearly sense it. Because McBride briefs the board and he says, we need to figure out how we can work with the Common Core standards by 2015, otherwise it could affect the federal dollars we receive. The very next meeting, despite their timeline, which said that they were going to start reviewing in April of 2010, in the very next meeting, the State Board of Education voted to adopt the Common Core's revised standards. Pretty much Wyoming's fate was sealed. We had the largest school district in the state had already started implementing it. The State Board of Education, despite their own timeline, said, hey, we're going to go ahead and get this adopted so that we can put it on our Race to the Top application. We didn't get it anyway, but it certainly, they were hoping, and if you read our Race to the Top application, it's about 500 pages, and I know that Kelly and a few others have read it. It's substantial to read. And if you read the 5 reviewers who reviewed it and denied us, you understand in the application that we got dinged because we didn't adopt it fast enough. The State Board of Education would go on to continue the content standard reviews. They already had a timeline. We had our content standard teams. The state has teams of professionals, teachers and professors from the university who do the content standard review. They were involved and they had been looking at the ELA and math portions that spring of 2010 before the June 16th vote. But these reviews and the votes, you just can't look at them any other way but being perfunctory, because it was very obvious that we were not going out to find standards based on quality. We were going out to find standards based on federal dollars and speed. In that period between March and April 2nd of that spring, the Department of Education did do a public and teacher comment period for those content standards. And in the same board meeting that they voted for them, the state board got those comments in their board packet that they get. And in the packet we have reviews from teachers that said things like, still too many unknowns. I would not accept the Common Core standards as now written, knowing there are changes coming. Because remember, these standards were not completely finished nationally. I would want to see them first before I could recommend the standards. I think there are too many questions about them. I think the developmental questions that need to be answered to accept them. I hated that language arts has been reduced to a set of skills. Literature does so much more in connecting us with the world and each other. Some of the skills or the themes are not developmentally attainable, even in the 9th grade. Our kids are more than test scores. You've got to be kidding me. These standards are so poorly written that adopting them would be a joke. And the one that I think is most profound. From what source did these standards come? I know that I was never contacted to engage in this composition process. Who was? So there you kind of have an overview of what and how Wyoming essentially got those standards. As I said, I've talked to quite a few teachers around the state, again, most of whom don't want their names put out there. Many of whom have felt very afraid to talk about it. A lot of them are English teachers who utterly despise these standards, these new standards, and the move away from complex literature into informational text. It's completely changed the way many of them teach. And they're deeply troubled by that. They're deeply troubled by the lack of peer review, by the lack of any kind of academic review showing that this is actually going to work. So this next section is just sort of my laundry list of things that I think the state could do to essentially attempt some real education freedom. Deregulating private schools and homeschooling, allowing for a more free and innovative private school system in the state. We need to begin to untie the federal strings by removing the Common Core standards. If we want to discuss the standards as a set of standards, then I have no problem with that. If we want to discuss the quality of those standards, then that's fine. What I say is adopting these standards as a package deal, using race at the top, flexibility waivers, and the fact that these are copyrighted standards that we can't change. I think that's thank you. I think that is too high of a price for Wyoming to pay in having these standards. We can have quality standards without sacrificing the things that we have to sacrifice to get these particular standards. And I like to use the analogy. When you've driven your car to the very end of its life and you decide it's time to go get a new one, you recognize that your car is not good. It's not good. So what do you usually do? You don't go out and just look at one vehicle and compare it to your car and say, yeah, it's better than my car. I guess I'll buy that. You go out and you look at 5 or 6 cars, don't you? You talk about gas mileage, you talk about your family size, you talk about safety ratings, you talk about a whole bunch of things, and then you buy a car. That's what you do when you're looking for a quality product. We want quality in our standards. And while many people have discussed the rigor in these standards, I still say with great certainty that we didn't go out looking for quality. We did it for expediency. We did it to be involved in this federal scheme to get race to the top monies, to get a flexibility waiver. If we want real quality, and there's no one in this room who doesn't want quality in education, every educator wants quality, then we should have been out looking at other standards, and Kelly touched on it. We should have looked at Massachusetts as the ELA standards. We should have looked at Texas as NAF standards. That is not how the State Board of Education reviewed these standards. They hired an auditing company called McRell, who came in, took our standards, put them next to the Common Core, and said, yep, they're better. That's all we did. So we need to untie those federal strings and get out of the Common Core scheme. If we want to discuss inside the standards things that we like or don't like about it, then let's bring Wyoming teachers and Wyoming professionals together and let's have that discussion. I think that's a good discussion to have. We also need to remove Wyoming from the Smarter Balance Consortium. Kelly touched on many of the problems, the assessment that's coming down. One of the big arguments about having the Common Core nationally is that we can compare test scores, so they say, to all the other states. And I think Kelly's touched upon the problem with that when you have 2 different kinds of tests between PARC and the Smarter Balance Consortium. We need to restructure the State Board of Education, making it an elected board, allowing parents and teachers more representation statewide, not less. What we have seen in Wyoming and in Cheyenne in particular, both with the passage of Senate File 104 and also with the way in which the State Board of Education has adopted these Common Core standards, is a push to consolidate power. That's not good for any of us. Power needs to be diffused. And if you read the education statute, you will recognize that the State Board of Education has way more power as far as power that affects our kids than actually the superintendent does. So those State Board of Education members need to be accountable to all of you. When they're just appointed by a governor, they're not accountable. They don't feel the sense of political pressure that someone who's elected does. So electing the State Board of Education, I think, is very important. And certainly for those who are very, very upset about 104, giving back those authorities to the superintendent is not something that would be bad to do. It's something we should certainly try to do. At the state level, we need to recalibrate the state education funding model. Right now, the way we fund schools is we fund schools. We do it very much at a district level. We look at it in a district scheme. And it is my belief and the belief of the Liberty Group that we need to be child-focused and we need to backpack funds so that money that is flowing into a district is flowing in there at a child level. So we're looking at the child instead of just the district. And we need to incentivize districts to establish those kind of backpack funding so that they understand how important it is to budget in a backpacking way. We also need to establish a separate charter school authorizer. And the last one is what I touched on earlier about this flexibility waiver. We have right now the state of Wyoming. We did apply for the flexibility waiver, the one that has those 4 non-statutory provisions in them. Let's see if I can go back to them real quick so you can see them. Those 4 non-statutory provisions. In February of this year, we did apply for that flexibility waiver. Thankfully, I think a week ago, the Department of Education withdrew our flexibility application. We did it basically because essentially we were not going to get our flexibility waiver because we are 1 year behind in number 3. We are 1 year behind in developing our teacher and leader evaluation system. The federal government has a rigid timeline on how they want to do it. And the state of Wyoming basically said, listen, we don't want to compromise our internal timeline, so we're just going to walk away from this waiver for 1 year. What we did do, however, is we applied for a smaller waiver, which is simply we asked the federal government, upon their encouragement, according to the Department of Education. I talked to Dr. David Holbrook, who's the head of federal grants, and what he told me was that we applied for a smaller waiver under the federal government's encouragement that would simply freeze those annual measurable objectives. So if you remember, those objectives were supposed to be getting us at 100% proficiency by 2014, which we were not at. We've asked to freeze those at the 2012 level so that our school districts will not get the punishment that's going to come down in 2014 for not having them. It's my understanding, and what the State Department of Education feels, we will probably get that smaller waiver. So for now, the flexibility waivers, we did not get the race to the top money. We've taken the flexibility waiver off the table. So for those of us who want to have a real conversation about whether we should continue down this path, we essentially have a 1 year window. And I'm very glad about that. We have a 1 year, the last screen said questions. We have a 1 year window in which we can have a conversation around the state, and that's what we're trying to do.